On November 28, 1980, in Denver, Colorado, Kristen Swanson completed her shift as a waitress at the Ramadan Inn. The 22-year-old was last seen departing from the work parking lot. She had borrowed a friend's car and was heading home to shower and change for a party later that night. She did not arrive at the party, which worried her friends and fiancé, who were unable to find her that evening. The next morning, a bus driver discovered her body in the borrowed vehicle. She was stabbed once in the chest and had been assaulted. Her autopsy determined that her cause of death was a stab wound to the heart. The subsequent investigation quickly led to several dead ends. In her case, like so many others at the time, it went cold. DNA evidence was collected and preserved to await technology that didn't exist yet. For years, those who remembered Kristen continued to advocate on her behalf. In 2009, the Denver Police Department reopened the investigation after a friend of Kristen had urged investigators to re-examine the evidence. It didn't take long for investigators to have a suspect once the samples were uploaded to the national databases. They had a hit from an ex-felon with a lengthy criminal record. Roderick Bernard Elias, now 53, was arrested in March 2010. In 1980, he had been out on parole and was living with his brother in the Denver area. Images of him in 1980 matched the description of a man that had been hanging around outside the hotel bar that Kristen had worked at. It is believed that he followed her and may have forced her off the road or somehow convinced her to pull over, then attacked her. He had been arrested in 1973 for aggravated assault, released, then was back in prison in 1978 for theft and burglary. Then he was in and out of prison for the better part of the 80s-90s for burglary, possession of burglary tools, theft, criminal damage to property, and attempted robbery. Despite him matching the description of a person of interest and his criminal history, Elias would never been a suspect in the slaying of Kristen Swanson. At this time, it is unclear why he targeted Kristen, and Denver police are not looking into any other cold cases in the area to see if there are other victims. Kristen's mother and sister were ecstatic about the arrest and grateful to have justice after so many years. On January 2, 1959 in Great Falls, Montana, Patricia Kitzski went out on a date with her boyfriend, Lloyd Dwayne Bogle. The two had gone to a drive-in movie, and after the movie, there was a little time before Patty needed to go home. Patty was a junior in high school, and Lloyd was an airman stationed at the Malmstrom Air Force Base. Though the two hadn't been dating for long, they were very serious and had even started talking about marriage. The two park next to the Sun River near Wadsworth Park, a common lover's lane. That evening, as the clock ticked on, Patty's parents grew increasingly nervous. It wasn't like her not to come home, and it was initially thought that the young couple might have gone off to elope. It wasn't uncommon for two people to get swept up in love. When night turned to day, their concerns turned to terror when the body of Bogle was discovered near his vehicle. His had been discovered by 3 young boys. He had his hands tied behind his back and had been shot once in the back of the head. First, there was no sign of Patty. A search party formed, but it wasn't until the following day when Patty was recovered, located 7 miles from where Bogle was found and down a steep embankment. She was fully clothed and had also been shot in the back of the head. Robbery didn't seem to be a motive for the slayings, as Bogle's money and camera were found in the vehicle. Officers said in the statement at the time, "We're grabbing at every straw we can find. We have a mad killer on the loose." Without a motive or suspect, the case went cold. Eventually, it became Great Falls' oldest cold case. There were several attempts to close the case. In 1989, a tree in the area where Bogle had been murdered was cut down because it contained a bullet. Though it was determined to not be related to the case, the final hope in solving the case came down to DNA evidence recovered from Patty's body, though it had been collected at a time long before law enforcement would ever have known of such a thing. The DNA evidence was sent off to Bode in 2019. The sample yielded a genetic profile, and from there it was uploaded to several voluntary genealogy databases. From there, genealogists were able to piece a family tree, starting from distant cousins and finally narrowing it down to a suspect. Kenneth Gold had died in 2007, but a DNA sample was offered to law enforcement from his daughter. They determined that Gold was perpetrator of the murders. Gold had never been a suspect, and he had no criminal history. His daughter was shocked by the revelation. We will never know why he murdered the young couple, but he would have been about 29 at the time of the slayings. A month after the murders, Gold had sold his property and moved out of Montana. He had lived a block from Patty's home and had worked corralling horses even closer. Perhaps he was jealous or had been stalking Patty. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. Was January 27, 1996 when 17-year-old Gladis Ariano went missing from her home in Boyles Heights, Los Angeles, California. Gladis' family reported her missing the following day and a search of the area was undertaken. 3 days later, on January 30th, a body was reported. It was the missing teen, partially clad at the bottom of a ravine. Located 34 miles from downtown LA, she was found in a remote area of Topanga Canyon Road. She had been assaulted and strangled to death. A DNA sample was collected from Gladis' body, which generated a profile that detectives were able to input into the California state databases. Officers were hopeful that they would find a match quickly, but the case went cold for nearly 25 years. Finally, detectives got a hit they were waiting for, a positive match. In November 2019, Jose Luis Garcia was arrested for domestic assault. As per California laws, Garcia was required to submit a DNA sample to the state. Officers gathered a warrant to obtain another sample to directly compare to the sample from the crime scene. It was then that officers learned that after Garcia had been released in November, he immediately moved to Dallas, Texas. Garcia was picked up by Texas federal law enforcement. He was questioned about the 1996 slaying at his home, but claimed he had no knowledge of Gladis. His DNA was taken while in Texas, and it was determined to be a direct match. He was unarrested and extradited back to California. In 1996, Garcia had been a year older than Gladis, now 43. The then 18-year-old had lived near Gladis. At the time, there is no additional information to motive of the slain. Gladis' older sister and niece spoke at a press conference and thanked detectives. The detectives in this case were part of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department Homicide Bureau Unsolved Case Unit. Comprised of 12 retired homicide detectives, they work on cold cases on a part-time basis, and the LA County alone has over 15,000 unsolved cold cases. Jose Luis Garcia has pleaded not guilty and is awaiting a trial date. He is currently being held on a $1 million bail. Peter Winston's story brings to mind the Queen's Gambit. While fictional, it explored the internal battles of brilliance, mental health, and substance abuse. This missing person case is peculiar because no official missing person file was ever created, leading to an investigation being launched. Peter Winston simply vanished, and his family chose not to comment on his disappearance. Born in New York City in 1958, Peter's case remains shrouded in mystery. His father, Leonard Winston, was described as a thin and slight man who taught chemistry at Columbia. His mother, Florence, was also an intellectual with a teaching degree from Columbia. She also dabbled in theater, occasionally taking parts in small productions when she wasn't teaching. He also had a sister, Wind Winston, though she was 10 years older than him and they didn't really grow up together. They were close. People remark that his childhood may have been unique, noting that he still slept in a crib in his parents' bedroom at 6. Leonard Winston passed suddenly when Peter was only 9 after his father's passing. His mother seemed to cling to him harder. Peter stood out as special from an early age. He was reported to have started reading before he'd even turned 2 years old and could do simple math by 3. He began attending a gifted children's school at age 5 where he would argue the existence of God with his classmates. Those who remembered him from school, classmates and teachers alike, described Peter the same. He was the smartest person they had ever met. But he struggled in school, and by 12 he would tell he started experimenting with LSD despite often having bad trips. It is unclear when Peter turned to chess, but it was a major part of his life from an early age. At 14, he was defeating opponents 10 years his senior and often competed in tournaments and winning. When he started college, his mother had him hospitalized. At first he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, but his diagnosis was later changed to manic depression. He was put on medication, but he didn't like how it affected his mind and it negatively impacted his chess performance. His once promising chess career was crumbling as he began to lose more matches than he won. By 1977, he stopped winning games altogether and he would frequently go off his medication and spiral down conspiratorial rabbit holes. He would neglect personal hygiene and rumors often surrounded him that he was mixed up with drugs. However, those closest to him believed it was him quitting lithium cold turkey that the source of his erratic behavior. On the last day he was seen alive, he was reported as acting erratically and impulsively gambled the money he had on horse races. He also called a chess rival and asked him for a ride home. When he was refused, he called his sister. His sister picked him up and took him to her place to stay the night. Following morning, his sister insisted that he see a doctor, and without warning, he jumped up and ran out of her apartment screaming. He called up an old friend and went to their house. They had lunch, and while they were eating, Peter said he was going to Texas to see Walter Korn, the author of the chess Bible, Modern Chess Openings. He repeatedly said that Korn was God, and his comments concerned his friend's parents, and those parents decided what best Peter's mother was called. When Peter learned his mother knew where he was, he left. This was the last time he was seen alive. The days following his disappearance, the blizzard of 1978 hit New York. Peter didn't have a coat with him, and it is feared he died in the bad weather. Because he was never reported missing, there was never a missing person filed to compare him to. New York has over 30,000 unidentified bodies within the state. The answer may lie there. Hopefully, with enough publicity, someone will open up an investigation, and those who remember Peter and want answers can get some. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. Joseph J. Deare, born in 1910, grew up in Boston alongside his younger brothers, Dominic and Joseph. The strong bond they shared as children persisted into their adult years. In 1928, the three siblings launched a business selling fresh produce. Initially starting with a push cart, they eventually opened a store in Boston. Their business expanded, leading them to relocate to a larger space in Quincy Market in 1930. By 1939, their business expanded nationally. The Deare brothers formed partnerships with tomato growers in different states like Florida, Texas, and California to meet the needs of supermarket chains. They were also the first in New England to import tomatoes directly from Cuba, ensuring a year-round supply for their customers. As their business thrived, the brothers decided to invest in farming. They started planting tomatoes in open packing operations in Florida and later in California. They expanded to other locations like South Carolina. In 1937, Joseph married Josephine, who was just 2 years younger than him. In the early 1940s, Joseph, Josephine, and their 3 children, Joseph Jr., James, and Richard, moved from Boston to North Miami, where Joseph and his brothers had built their livelihood by selling fresh produce. Joseph Deare lived in Miami Beach before moving to Keystone Island in North Miami. In 1953, Joseph's only daughter Linda was born. Unfortunately, his beloved wife, Josephine, passed away from breast cancer soon after in 1956. 3 years later, in 1959, Joseph Deare married Frances, a woman 20 years younger than him. In the late 1950s, winter farming meant lighting kerosene lamps and placing them between rows of tomato plants to ward off the frost. Richard remembered his father waking them and then leading them to the fields to ensure their crops didn't freeze. Joseph and his 3 sons would drive into farms and work on the tomato plants before they were sent off to processing. In March 1961, 21-year-old Richard traveled to Ohio to meet with his brothers and business partners to discuss the possibility of his Frances and Joseph getting a divorce and to update his 52-year-old father's will. His stepmother Frances was not living with them at the time. Joseph Deare ran various aspects of the business from Miami and frequently traveled across the United States and Latin America. In 1961, he and his new wife Frances lived in the Keystone Point home along with Joseph's daughter, while his sons lived on the family's farm in Bradenton. But what was about to take place was something none of them could have ever expected. It was a cold winter night in Bradenton on March 24, 1961, and at 3 a.m. Richard and his 2 brothers were fast asleep on their father's farm. But at the same time, the police received a frantic call from Frances Deare, who told them a horrifying tale. She said that she and Joseph had gone out for dinner from their Keystone Point home. Frances had taken the wheel of their Cadillac Fleetwood and Joseph sat next to her as they left for dinner. They stopped at an intersection near the south exit of Keystone Point, just west of the Broad Causeway. Suddenly, two men jumped into their car, causing chaos. One of the men forcefully held a gun to the back of Frances's head, making her drive to an empty lot in Sans Souci Estates. Joseph turned to look and was violently struck in the face with the pistol. Frances screamed and also got hit. Frances was knocked unconscious when she was hit with the gun. When she woke up, she found Joseph dead in the seat beside her and the murderers had fled. In a moment of panic, she raced through the brambles and bushes to a nearby Phillips 66 service station. It was from there that she called the police. Patrolman Ben Scola of the North Miami Police Department arrived at the scene as the first officer. He observed Frances at the gas station, noting that she didn't appear severely injured. There are scratches on her face and some specks of blood can be seen on her dress. The scratches seem self-inflicted, as if she ran her hands down her face. Frances informed him that she was knocked out or rendered unconscious and unable to witness the shooting. During the investigation, shell casings were discovered in the back seat of the Cadillac. Upon closer examination of photographs, it became apparent that there were at least 2 unspent rounds on the back seat as well. According to police records, Norman Logan, an employee of the gas station, stated that Frances never mentioned her husband being shot until the arrival of the police. 2 nearby fishermen claimed they didn't hear anything during the incident. Frances informed the police that the assailants took jewelry worth $5,000 from her and $400 in cash from her husband. However, despite the robbery, a gold ring and diamond cufflinks were still found on her husband's body. A day after the murder and robbery, according to the Miami Herald, it was reported that Frances said the gunman forcefully took her jewelry. Despite being ordered not to turn around, she disobeyed, and one of the bandits struck her with his pistol, causing her to lose consciousness. However, to the police earlier, she said that her husband had turned around. The article went on to say that upon regaining consciousness several minutes later, Frances discovered that the attackers had fled and her husband was slumped against the car door with blood flowing from his head. Overwhelmed with panic, she swiftly made her way through the brambles, bushes, and sharp rocks to a nearby Phillips 66 service station where she called the police for assistance. During a subsequent interview with the Miami Herald conducted after the murder, Frances revealed that the assailant referred to her husband as Frank instead of Joe for some unknown reason. She speculated that they may have mistaken Joe for someone else. This information was also not given to the police when they had spoken to her about the murder. Other news reports from the time stated that Frances recounted how the gunman violently struck her with the pistol when she became hysterical as they attempted to take her jewelry. This caused her to lose consciousness, and upon waking up, she discovered that her husband had been shot. The hysterical part here was again not mentioned to the police in the interview they had conducted with Frances. In another article published by the Herald, it was mentioned that Frances reached the gas station and informed Norman Logan, the owner's son, that the 2 men had entered the car, one in the back and one in the front. But when the police arrived at the gas station on the night of the murder, Norman had made it clear to them that Frances had not mentioned the murder until their arrival. There were many discrepancies in the way that Frances was explaining the shootout in the murder scene. Was this because she was under pressure from someone? While all this was happening, Joseph's brothers weren't in the picture at all. Were they hiding something? The passing of Joseph meant that the Deare business would only be divided between the 2 remaining brothers. A motive the police looked at closely at the time. Frances wasn't done yet, though. She proceeded to provide an exclusive interview to the Herald again in the same week where she recounted the events again. This time she explained that as they approached the Causeway Bayshore intersection, 2 men suddenly entered the back seat of the car. A car was trailing behind, but there was no other traffic on the causeway. Frances was at the wheel, and one of the men held a pistol to the back of her head, telling her to follow their instructions precisely. They directed her to continue straight ahead towards Sans Souci Estates. After driving for approximately 1 block, They ordered her to make a right-hand turn off Bayshore Drive. Curiosity prompted her husband, Joe, to ask the men what they wanted. One of the assailants responded, stating their intention to obtain his money. They insisted that both Francis and Joe keep their heads facing forward, but Joe repeatedly turned back, attempting to resist them. On one occasion, he turned and received a forceful blow to the face. He then turned to Francis, and she saw that he was bleeding. Shortly after, he turned back again, and they struck him once more. In response, Francis began screaming. The attackers then hit her twice on the head. When she regained consciousness, she found herself lying on the gravel outside the car. The assailant had taken all her jewelry valued at approximately $5,000. Joe had around $400 in cash at the time, which she later discovered was also taken. Francis firmly believed that the men were not amateurs. Their composed and methodical demeanor left her convinced of their experience. Although she did not get a clear look at them, their manner of speaking did not align with that of hoodlums. Francis could not shake the thought a terrible mistake had been made, since the men referred to her husband as Frank instead of Joe for some inexplicable reason. She said that she believed that they had mistaken Joe for someone else, or perhaps their primary motive was simply robbery. She did not believe that they had any intention of causing harm. Now, in this interview, Francis logically covered all the points that did not match the statements she gave to the police in interviews she gave to newspapers. But why was she defending her statements? If she had a concussion from the blow she received on her head, it was obvious that she would not remember all the events precisely. But what was more interesting was that she was defending the assailants too, by saying that they might have mistaken Joseph for someone, and their prime motive was only robbery and not murder. This led the police to theorize that the killer was maybe someone very close to Joseph and Francis. Since technology was not very evolved in those days, the police could not gather any DNA samples or even fingerprints that could help them identify the killers. There were no other clues because nobody saw the killers, and they fled before Francis gained consciousness. So the case gradually went cold. But Richard, Joseph's son, remembered that there was some tensions between Francis and Joseph before Joseph got murdered. In fact, Richard had a meeting with the other family members to discuss his father's will, and also the divorce with Francis, and Francis was not living with Joseph at the time of the murder. She had left for Ohio. She had come back when she heard that Joseph had made changes to his will. His will now read that Francis would only receive part of the estate if she lived with Joseph throughout their marriage. On the day of Joseph's funeral, Richard remembered that Francis did not even shed a tear. She was as straight-faced as they come. She was more interested in doing her hair for the funeral than the funeral itself. And despite her saying that she was hit with the butt of the pistol on her forehead, there were no signs of a wound on her forehead at all. After the funeral, Francis ordered all of Joseph's children to move out within 24 hours, and Francis herself received $250,000 out of Joseph's will. In a few weeks after Joseph's funeral, Francis remarried another man. Surprisingly, this was the attorney who was going to represent Francis during her divorce proceedings. Almost 2 decades later, in 1980s, Richard started looking into the case again with the help of an attorney and volunteer, Paul Novak. Novak was experienced with crimes happening in and around Miami. After much consideration, Novak advised Richard to send the case to a forensic scientist. Novak knew that there had been a lot of organized crime occurring in Miami in the 1960s, and there were many crimes linked to one another. So Novak and Richard thought that this might be a mafia hit, as Joseph was a successful businessman. In 1991, almost 30 years after Joseph's death, Richard Deare saw another perspective on the case. He reached out to John Thornton, a forensic science professor at the University of California, Berkeley, for a second opinion. After reviewing the case, Thornton wrote a letter to the Miami-Dade police expressing his doubts about Francis's statements. He found it unlikely that the situation she described matched the gunshot wounds, which seemed to have been fired from 2 different angles. Additionally, Thornton pointed out that the amount of blood discovered at the crime scene did not align with the amount of time Francis claimed the incident took, but the police could not consider it because there was no evidence. Another police officer at that time revealed that Francis could have been suspected during the initial investigation, but a high-ranking official had ordered the police to not conduct an investigation on Frances as she was widowed in grief and also a victim, and hence, the police did not further investigate the Frances angle, nor did they question her again. Then, for decades later in the 2000s, some officers came to Richard with a list of suspects. The police department was looking into the older cases, and Joseph's murder was one of these. These suspects were already on the list that Richard had made through his own investigations, but Frances was not on the list. In 2006, Frances Deare died. She was 82. She had married 4 times, including her marriage to Joseph Deare. Around 2019, almost 6 decades after Joseph Deare's murder and 2 decades after Frances's death, the homicide squad at the cold case squad of the Miami-Dade Police Department, along with Paul Novak, started turning the pages of the Joseph Deare cold case file again. In the old police reports, they found many clues regarding the investigation. First, after his father's murder, Richard had given some shell casings to the police. These shell casings came out of a .25 caliber SATA, an Italian auto pistol, a gun that Joseph owned, but was with Frances all the time. Richard himself had fired some bullets with the gun into their house's swimming pool and had recovered the shell casings. But why did Richard give these casings to the police? Because these casings were similar to the shell casings found in the back seat of Joseph's car when he was murdered. There had been 2 empty rounds still lying there when the body was found. According to the police investigation, Joseph sustained 4 gunshot wounds. 2 bullets were fired from the front, directly into his mouth. The other 2 rounds were shot from the left side, hitting the area in front of and behind his left ear. These shots were fired from an extremely close distance, leaving traces of gunpowder around the wounds. This meant that Joseph had been killed by someone who was very close to him in terms of proximity. It also meant that the assailants weren't sitting in the back seat, as the wounds were on his mouth and around his left ear, making it clear that whoever shot him first from Joseph's left side, and then also through his mouth to confirm that Joseph had died. In addition to the gunshot wounds, Joseph had 9 bruises or cuts on his head. He also had bruises on his left arm and right index finger, which meant that Joseph did struggle before he was shot, or that he was dragged after he was shot. Blood was found inside the car on both the front and the back seats, as well as on the car's exterior. The blood flowed down the window and seeped out from the bottom of the door. During a re-examination in late 2019, it was reaffirmed that no blood was discovered on the driver's seat, steering wheel, or driver's door. There was also no blood splatter found beyond the center of the front seat. This meant that whoever was sitting in the driver's seat, that is Frances, was not wounded at all. On the car's exterior, streaks of blood were observed moving backward. The amount of blood indicated the seriousness of the wounds and the time it took for the bleeding to occur after the gunshot. This meant that the vehicle was moving when Joseph was shot, and it kept moving when he was bleeding. This too was contrary to what Frances had said. She had said that she went unconscious while being in the driver's seat, so the car could not have kept moving after that. No blood was discovered in Joseph's lungs. However, slight redness was observed on his jaw. Medical experts suggested that these findings could suggest that someone had their arm around Joseph's neck when he was shot, blocking his airway. Alternatively, it could mean that the fatal shot caused an immediate stoppage of breathing. Joseph's gold ring and diamond cufflinks were still on him when he was discovered in the car, contradicting Frances' claim that it was a robbery. 2 men who were fishing nearby did not hear any gunshots or any signs of a struggle or even a bullet being fired. Frances had no cuts on her feet, and her shoes were found near the car in a manner that suggested that they were deliberately placed, not scattered. When a female deputy replicated the path Frances claimed to have taken from the car to the gas station while barefoot, her feet were cut and bruised in multiple places. The initial person Frances spoke to at the gas station was Norman Logan, who reported that she never mentioned her husband being shot, but the biggest blows were yet to come. When the detectives along with Novak ran ballistic tests, they found that the trajectory of the bullets in the crime scene could only be fulfilled if the bullet was fired from the driver's end. It did not match the trajectory of the bullets mentioned by Frances in her original statements. Moreover, the shell casings that Richard gave to the police were confirmed to be the same as the shells of the bullets used to kill Joseph, meaning that Joseph was also killed by a .25 caliber SATA. The same gun had been missing from the Deare household on the day Joseph went out with Frances for the last time. But the most revealing thing about the case reports was that a trail of blood was found from Joseph's garage, leading to the spot where Joseph's Cadillac was parked. This clearly indicated that, in fact, Joseph had been shot in his garage when he was with Frances at home before they ever left for dinner. Now, the detectives of the homicide squad, along with Novak, knew that Frances could only get Joseph's estate only if she was with him throughout their marriage, and that's what happened. Frances was with Joseph until Joseph's death, and hence, she got the $250,000. The police concluded that the divorce angle and Joseph's will was reason enough for Frances to kill Joseph and get the money from him. This, along with all the obvious clues, was reason enough for the police to conclude that there was just one person who would do all this, and that was Frances Deare. On May 10, 2023, almost 3 years after the Joseph Deare cold case was reopened, the Miami-Dade Homicide and Cold Case Squad held a press conference. There were concerns that she would be out of the will if she wasn't living in the marital home. We know that she wasn't in Miami prior to the homicide, and that when she found that out, she did travel back. In that, they announced that they had reason enough to believe that Frances Deare killed Joseph Deare. The motive for her killing was the impending divorce and Joseph changing the will. The way she did it was by shooting Joseph in their house's garage, then driving the car to another spot 3 or 4 miles ahead, then walking barefoot to the gas station and calling the police, while leaving Joseph's body in the car itself. The police also believed that the .25 caliber Satigun was thrown by Frances Ballone under bridge, and hence the murder weapon was never found. After this announcement, Richard, who is 82 now, said that he was relieved, but he was not happy at all. He knew his stepmother was the killer. Richard also revealed that in 1961, he had told the police to investigate Frances and she was the killer, and the police had refused to do so. Frances passing away in 2006 meant there was no way for her to answer for her crime. She had lived a full life without ever being held accountable for her actions. Novak said that this case was just a prime example of how politics can overshadow justice. The high-ranking official who ordered the police to leave Frances alone still remains unknown. The Deare company since has grown a lot, spreading internationally. On their websites, they mentioned that the Deare companies continue to uphold the values of hard work, integrity, and excellence established by the brothers. They believe that their determination and perseverance live on through future generations of the Deare family and their dedicated employees. Richard was also influenced by these values and continued to seek justice for his father. And despite the fact that his stepmother will never see justice, he can have some peace in knowing that she did it. Why do you think Frances was not looked at more closely during the initial investigations? Do you think there was a larger conspiracy that was covered up? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. 85-year-old Robert Hunback and his wife, 77-year-old Goldie, cherished their longtime residence at 311 West 10th Street in Waterloo, Iowa. During the summer, the serene couple enjoyed sitting on their glider swing in the backyard, chatting with neighborhood children as they played. Sadly, in 1981, their time at the house was nearing its end. Scheduled for demolition in 1984 due to a State Department of Transportation project to expand U.S. Highway 218, the couple chose to use this opportunity to relocate closer to their children in Independence, situated east of Waterloo. They had received an advance in the buyout of their current home and were going to use that money to move out to Independence. Robert and Goldie's family last spoke to them on Saturday, January 10, 1981. The following Monday, 12th, a concerned family friend called police when neither Robert nor Goldie answered their door. When police entered the house, they found the couple's bodies, Robert in the dining room and Goldie in the upstairs hallway. They had both been shot. They were also both bound, gagged, and blindfolded. Goldie had a clothespin pinned on her nose. Robert had sustained injuries from some sort of blunt object and had injuries which appeared to have been caused by an electric cattle prod that was found in the master bedroom. The home had been ransacked. Police believed robbery had been the motive for the crime. Despite authorities conducting dozens of interviews and offering a $5,000 reward, the case went cold. The case would not be solved for more than 31 years, and not by police efforts, but as the result of a spontaneous confession. On May 8, 2012, 66-year-old Jack Wendell Purcell walked into the Waterloo police station and confessed to the murders. Authorities did not just take his word for it, however, and Purcell was questioned extensively for 2 days. Police went through their files to compare the details of the crime with those provided by Purcell. Some of the details of the crime, like the number of bullet wounds and their location as well as the color of the cattle prod used to torture Robert, could not have been known by anyone outside of law enforcement besides the killer. Investigators went through newspaper archives to ensure they were correct about what information had and had not been made available to the public. Purcell was charged with the murders and remained in custody while investigators continued to work to validate his claims. This involved traveling to California, where Purcell had been living. They tried to search his apartment, but he had sold everything he owned. The proceeds from those sales had been deposited into a bank account Purcell had turned over to authorities to pay restitution to the Hunteback family. While in California, they also interviewed Bruce Davis, a former member of the Manson family who was serving life in prison for murder. Purcell had told police that he had confessed to the murders to Davis, who was active in ministry at the prison where he and Purcell were incarcerated 20 years earlier. Davis had denied any knowledge of the murders when investigators talked to him over the phone, but when they came to see him in person, he confirmed that Purcell had confessed to the murders to him 20 years earlier. Purcell had been the murders to him 20 years earlier. Purcell had been in prison with Davis while serving time for multiple counts of oral copulation with a minor. A warrant for his arrest for those charges was out when he killed Robert and Goldie. He had been on the run from authorities in California, trying to avoid facing the charges. He had dated a relative of the Huntbacks recently and took a bus to Waterloo in order to rob the couple. He killed them after they recognized his voice. He took between $56,000 during the robbery. He then flew from Waterloo to Chicago and remained transient until he was arrested while hitchhiking in Wyoming and returned to California to face his pending charges. He began serving a 21-year sentence in September of 1981. He was considered a person of interest in Robert and Goldie's murders, and authorities had tried to interview him twice while he was incarcerated about the case, but he had asked for a lawyer both times. Purcell was paroled in 1992 and fully discharged from his sentence in 1995. He worked as a truck driver for many years before retiring and had been living in Southgate, California prior to turning himself in to the police in Iowa. Purcell had turned himself in because he had become a born-again Christian and believed it was the right thing to do. Shortly before he turned himself in, Purcell had called his brother, who was living in the Midwest and hadn't spoken with him in years, and confessed to the murders. The brother has spoken to the press but asked not to be named. The brother was shocked at the confession but agreed to help Purcell turn himself in. Purcell flew from California to Des Moines, where his brother picked him up at the airport and drove him to Waterloo. Unfortunately, Purcell did not know where the police station was, and his brother had never even been to Waterloo. It took some time for them to locate someone who could give them directions on how to get there, but they ultimately arrived at the station and Purcell confessed to the murders. Purcell pleaded guilty to 2 charges of murder in the first degree, and his sentencing hearing was on June 7, 2012. He carried a Bible into court with him and told the judge that he was a Christian who threw himself on the mercy of the court and of the family of his victims. He believed that by taking responsibility for the murders, it would prevent him from going to hell. "I was forgiven of the sins of murder because I repented and was remorseful," he told the court. Purcell's confession did not earn him forgiveness from Robert and Goldie's loved ones. 2 of the Hunbacka's 3 children had passed away prior to their parents' case being solved. Approximately a dozen of the couple's relatives were in the court for the sentencing, and one of Robert and Goldie's grandsons and one of their granddaughters addressed the court. The grandson did not share Purcell's belief that he was guaranteed to not be condemned in the afterlife because he confessed in this life. "Someday you will face another judge. He will hear you and there will be a sentencing. What that sentence will be, nobody knows. But if I had any input or any say in that, may your eternal life burn in hell," he said to Purcell during the sentencing. The couple's granddaughter told the court she hoped Purcell would rot in prison and that she wished Iowa had the death penalty. Purcell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the mandatory sentence for first-degree murder under Iowa state law. He is serving his sentence at the Iowa State Penitentiary. Gwendolyn Elaine Fogle was born and raised in Orangeburg, South Carolina. In 1972, at the age of 20, she moved to Walterboro, South Carolina, and began working as a laboratory assistant at the regional hospital. She later left that position to become a medical assistant to one of the town's most prominent doctors. By 1978, she had begun taking classes at a local college to complete her degree, as well as art classes to further her goal of becoming an artist. Elaine had an endearing air of shyness about her, but she made friends easily. Both her relatives and her co-workers said she was always willing to go out of her way to help others. She was a hard worker, and the doctor she worked for would later say that he did not know of any finer person than Elaine. 26-year-old Elaine spent the evening of May 27, 1978, babysitting the children of two of her friends. The parents arrived home at 11:15. Elaine told them that she would be stopping at a nearby convenience store on her way back home. This meant that she would probably arrive at her home on South Lemack Street around 11:30. Elaine's roommate Nancy and friend Billy had spent Saturday at an Amway Products fair. It had been held approximately 150 miles away, so they did not arrive back at the home on South Lemack Street until 1:45 in the morning on Sunday. They were surprised to see that the light in the living room was still on. Elaine was spending Sunday with her family back in Orangeburg celebrating her mother's birthday. She had talked a lot about the trip because she was so excited to see her family and to celebrate with them. Nancy and Billy were therefore surprised that Elaine was up so late when she had to start a long drive in the morning. Sensing something was wrong, Billy decided to walk Nancy inside rather than just drop her off. She gave him her keys, and he walked ahead of her to the house. When he opened the front door, he was met with a horrifying sight: Elaine, half naked, covered in blood, and lying on the living room floor. Nancy and Billy ran back to the car and drove to the police station. The station was only a mile away, so driving there was faster than stopping to try to find a phone in the middle of the night. When officers arrived back at the house, they could not find Elaine's pulse. Neither could the paramedics, who arrived right after the police. Elaine's autopsy would reveal that she had been raped, beaten with several blunt objects, and strangled. She had sustained severe head wounds, and defensive wounds showed that she had fought back against her attacker. The doctor who performed the autopsy would ultimately conclude that Elaine had died of asphyxiation after being strangled with a fire poker that was found wrapped around her neck. Her killer must have been exceptionally strong, as he had bent the metal poker in half around Elaine's neck. It took two people to unbend the poker enough to remove it from her body at the autopsy. Elaine's parents were devastated by their daughter's death, and some of the circumstances of it only added insult to their injury. They were notified of Elaine's death, and Elaine's father was horrified to hear that Elaine had been found with her fire poker wrapped around her neck, because he had given the poker to her to keep by her door to use to protect herself. Police found footprints under all the windows along the back of Nancy and Elaine's home, indicating that the killer had tried to gain entry into the house at all of them before finally getting inside by breaking the glass of the dining room window and entering through it. The home had been found in disarray. Nancy's room appeared to have been gone through, and the living room showed signs of the fight Elaine had put up against her killer. Police theorized that the killer was already inside of the house when Elaine returned home. They believed that he potentially had broken into the home initially to commit burglary, and only decided to commit the sexually motivated murder when Elaine unexpectedly arrived home. The only item determined to be missing was Elaine's key ring. Since she had keys to the doctor's office where she worked on it, authorities became concerned that the killer had taken it to try to gain access to the office so that he could steal drugs. The doctor had all of the locks at his office changed immediately. Police watched the office for weeks in case someone came to try to break in with Elaine's keys, but no one ever did. The Walterboro Police Department had support from SLED, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. Potential suspects were identified, but no arrests were made, and the case went cold. Elaine's father died 2 years after she did, and her mother passed away in 1999. Despite the passage of time, Elaine's sister and extended family did not give up on her case. In 2015, leading up to the 37th anniversary of Elaine's death, her family wrote to the Walterboro Police Department asking for the case to be reopened. The department honored the request, and it was assigned to Detective Gene Johnson. As he began his investigation, he contacted retired Lieutenant Rita Schuler, who had retired from SLED in 2001. She had been the supervisor of the SLED Forensics Photography Lab in 1978 and had processed the photographs of Elaine's crime scene. She became close with Elaine's family when she was doing research on the case for her 2009 book Small Town Slayings in South Carolina. The two investigators hoped that advances in technology could help them finally identify Elaine's killer. The case file indicated that biological evidence had been recovered from Elaine's underwear, which had been found on the couch in her living room, leading them to hope that they had DNA evidence. Scientists were able to develop a DNA profile from the evidence, but it was a mixed sample containing DNA from Elaine and from an unknown male. Mixed samples are harder to match in databases, and investigators were unable to find a match in the combined DNA index system. Detective Johnson began collecting dozens of DNA samples from previous suspects identified in the case file and other men connected to the case. None were a match. It was not until Lieutenant Schuler remembered that they had another avenue of investigation that could help them identify Elaine's killer that progress was made in the investigation. The case file indicated that 2 unknown fingerprints and an unknown palm print had been found at the crime scene. However, the fingerprint lift cards for those prints were not with a case file. This would have been a major problem had Lieutenant Schuler not been working on the case. She had processed photographs of the fingerprints back in 1978 and remembered where she had filed the negatives of those photos. She called a current fingerprint examiner with SLED and told him where to look for the negatives. He was able to locate a photograph of the partial palm print, and the quality of the photograph was good enough that he was able to run the print through the automated fingerprint identification system. The system quickly returned to match. The print belonged to now 59-year-old James Willie Butterfield. His fingerprints were also matched to the 2 prints found on Elaine's window. Butterfield had an extensive criminal record going back decades. He had been arrested at least 10 times under his legal name and other aliases for crimes ranging from burglary to assault to unlawful removal of a body. He was charged with first-degree criminal sexual conduct in 2010, but the charge was dropped. However, his DNA was never entered into Cody's. His DNA was collected after his prints tied him to Elaine's murder, and it was found to be a match to the DNA from the crime scene. On December 1, 2015, Butterfield was arrested and charged with murder, first-degree criminal sexual conduct, and first-degree burglary. However, he has never stood trial for these crimes. At the time of his arrest, he was confined to a secure mental facility. He had been placed there following earlier criminal charges. At a hearing in July of 2017, a judge ruled that Butterfield was not mentally competent to stand trial for the charges he faced in connection to Elaine's case. He was to remain at the secure facility, where he will most likely spend the rest of his life. Elaine's loved ones were understandably upset that Butterfield would not be punished for killing her, but are glad to have answers after more than 37 years. Sharon Schmeer was a clever and confident teenager whose adventurous nature inspired her to strike out on her own at a very young age. At just 15 years old, she moved out on her own, living at the Oxford Manor Apartments in downtown Salt Lake City, Utah, and supporting herself by working as a waitress at the nearby Lamb's Grill. Sharon's mother, Sally, did not want her daughter to leave home so young. However, she understood that fighting her over the decision would just alienate Sharon from her, so she accepted the decision in order to maintain their relationship. Near the end of 1977, 16-year-old Sharon was unhappy living at Oxford Manor. Someone had broken into her apartment and robbed it a few weeks earlier, and she felt some of the other residents were too rowdy. On December 3rd, she and her mother spent the day looking for a new apartment. Ultimately, Sharon decided to make it through the next few months at her current apartment until her lease was up, so that she would get her deposit back and be able to use it to move into a new apartment. Sally received a phone call from the restaurant where Sharon worked. Sharon had not reported for her shift, which was not normal behavior for the responsible employee. Sally then went over to Sharon's apartment to check on her. Sharon did not answer the door. Sally then went downstairs to see the building manager and told him she needed to get into her daughter's apartment. He brought his set of keys up to Sharon's unit and let Sally inside. He waited in the living room while Sally searched the rest of the apartment. In the bathroom, Sally discovered her daughter's lifeless body in the bathtub. Sharon was nude with a halter top used as a gag in her mouth and a scarf wrapped around her head as a blindfold. There were approximately 6 inches of water in the tub, as well as some pieces of rope, and a butcher knife was outside of the tub on the bath mat. Sharon had been suffocated, strangled, and raped. There were no signs of forced entry into Sharon's apartment. Police conducted a thorough investigation. The case went cold, but it would ultimately be solved decades later, thanks to evidence preserved by the original investigators. In 2013, evidence from the case was submitted to a private lab where it underwent bag DNA testing. This type of testing allows her DNA to be extracted from non-ideal testing surfaces, such as porous ones. A full male DNA profile was extracted from the halter top that had been used to gag Sharon. The DNA was not run through the combined DNA index system until December of 2016. There was a match: 59-year-old Patrick Michael McCabe of Bell, Florida. McCabe was already known to police in Salt Lake City. He had been the building manager who let Sharon's mother into the apartment back in 1977 and had called 911 reporting the discovery of the body. Police now knew that when he let Sally into the apartment that day, he knew she would find her daughter's body and the state she would see her in. Imagine the gall that he walked up to that door and walked in with me, knowing what he had done, Sally would later say at McCabe's sentencing. McCabe had left Utah 2 months after Sharon was killed. His DNA wasn't Cody's because he had committed a sexual offense against a minor in 1999. He was convicted and served time in prison. He was extradited to Utah in early March of 2017 and charged with aggravated sexual assault, aggravated burglary, and murder in the first degree. Under current Utah law, the murder charge would be aggravated murder, but McCabe had to be charged using the legal language in place in 1977. By this time, he had already confessed to Sharon's rape and murder to authorities in Florida. According to McCabe, on the night of the murder, he had come home with sexual fantasies, but his girlfriend was asleep. He therefore used the keys he had as part of his job as the building manager to enter Sharon's apartment. When later asked in court what his motivation for entering the apartment that night was, he admitted that he had gone there with the intention of raping Sharon. He took a knife from the kitchen and entered Sharon's bedroom where she was sleeping. He woke her up and used the knife to subdue her. He tied her up and raped her before taking her to the bathroom where he strangled her and held her head underwater in the tub. On April 24, 2017, as part of a plea deal, McCabe pleaded guilty to 2 first-degree felonies, aggravated burglary and murder in the second degree. The sexual assault charge was dropped and the murder charge was reduced. This deal meant that McCabe would not face the death penalty. Sharon's family was relieved that they would not have to go through a trial, and they were not opposed to the death penalty being taken away as a potential sentence, as their main concern was ensuring McCabe could no longer hurt other people, a goal that could be accomplished by sending him to prison. Sharon's younger sister, Bridget Love, did express in court at McCabe's sentencing in June that she was not happy with the fact that McCabe was not being held accountable for her sister's rape. On June 7, 2017, McCabe was sentenced to 5 years to life for each of the crimes he had pleaded guilty to. The 2 sentences would be served consecutively. McCabe's arrest provided Sharon's family with some degree of peace that had eluded them for almost 4 decades. In December, when we got the call that they found him, I realized we had been living under a cloud for 39 years, Sharon's sister, Bridget, said at the sentencing. It's like the sun is actually starting to shine for us. Ulster County is a dynamic community with a deep historical and cultural heritage. Our case unfolded right here. However, the story starts with Thomas Coleman, born on March 22, 1967, in Queens, New York City. After graduating from West Babylon High School, he attended Stony Brook University and earned both his undergraduate and doctoral degrees from Damon College in Amherst, New York. Having resided in the neighborhood for over 20 years, Coleman worked as a physical therapist at Always There and served as the Director of Utilization Management for Optum Health's Physical Therapy Department. Michelle Coleman Weber was Tom's first wife. They remained close after the divorce. They both share children named Jillian and Bradley. After his divorce with Michelle, Tom married Linda. Linda already had a child, Brooke, from before she married Tom. However, Linda and Tom were also blessed with a son they named Ryan. At 44 years old, Thomas Coleman was a man who cherished the simple pleasures of life. Parties and wild nights out held no allure for him. Instead, he found solace in the warmth of his family's embrace. For Tom, quality triumphed over quantity. He found a true friend in the dentist, Dr. Gilberto Nunez. Their journey began during a tumultuous period in Gilberto's life as he navigated the treacherous waters of a difficult divorce. Seeking solace, he found himself drawn to the Coleman family, finding refuge in their unwavering support and genuine companionship. Thomas Coleman and his wife Linda forged a life filled with love and laughter, and it seemed like everything was going well for them. But fate can be cruel, and tragedy struck when Thomas Coleman's untimely death shocked those who knew him best. The parking lot of Planet Fitness, a popular gym in Kingston, Ulster County, where locals gathered to sweat away their stress, became the backdrop for a perplexing event on November 29, 2011. It was his wife Linda Coleman who first grew concerned when her attempts to reach Tom went unanswered. Like clockwork, he would embark on his daily fitness routine at the Planet Fitness gym before heading to work. Worried, Linda ventured to the familiar location only to find Tom's car parked in the lot. But as she approached, a horrifying truth began to unravel before her eyes. Linda found her husband dead in his car. At first glance, it appeared that Tom had succumbed to the merciless grip of a heart attack, given his weight and the common health issues that plagued men his age. It seemed a logical conclusion, but as the investigation unfolded, unsettling details emerged, casting doubt on this initial hypothesis. Tom lay motionless in the driver's seat as if in a peaceful sleep. His car was parked quite away from the gym's entrance despite the parking lot being empty. This peculiar positioning of his vehicle stirred suspicion among the investigators. Something strange was happening, and they had to figure out the mystery behind Tom Coleman's sudden death. As the authorities delved deeper into the case, another figure entered the scene, compounding the intrigue. Tom's friend, Dr. Gilberto Nunez, arrived at the scene to offer his condolences. Detective Michael Thomas, one of the first to arrive at the scene, couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The positioning of the body and the unusual parking spot baffled him. What secrets did his lifeless form hold? As experts combed through the car for clues, their efforts yielded no signs of foul play, no struggle, no evidence of distress. Yet the distance of the car from the gym building raised eyebrows. Who would park their car so far away when they intended to work out in the morning? The detectives knew they were dealing with a confusing case. The mystery deepened when the autopsy results revealed an unexpected twist. Thomas Coleman had died with midazolam, a sedative primarily used by medical professionals, coursing through his veins. Meanwhile, the police reviewed the recordings from the cameras near the parking lot, and at one point it was parked near Coleman's car in a mostly empty lot. The detectives in charge knew it was the same SUV that Tom's friend, Nunez, drove to the location. 3 days after Coleman's death, the detective asked Nunez to come in to the police station for questioning. Detective Thomas wanted to know more about Nunez's life and his connection to the victim. Nunez started talking a lot and confided in the detective. After a few minutes, Nunez admitted to having an affair with Tom's wife Linda. Nunez and Linda had been engaged in an affair for a year before the tragedy. The tangled web of deceit grew more intricate as Dr. Nunez confessed to assuming a false identity, posing as a woman named Samantha and sending explicit photos of the affair to Thomas. It was a desperate attempt to break the marriage and claim Linda for himself. This occurred some months before Tom's death. Nunez learned that Thomas was planning to employ a detective to look into Samantha's letter, so he offered his office's IT guy $500 to pretend to be a CIA computer expert and meet with the Colemans. Nunez then told them that he knew someone who could determine the source of the text. The IT specialist was supposed to display a fake CIA badge, but when his plan failed, Dr. Nunez resorted to confessing everything. He admitted to Tom that he was the one who had sent the compromising photos and begged for forgiveness. Astonishingly, The two men remained friends, continuing to exchange a flurry of text messages in the days leading up to Tom's death. After learning of the affair, the detectives felt the need to investigate Núñez. What they discovered was alarming. Gilberto Núñez, hailing from the Dominican Republic, was not only a respected volunteer firefighter, but also a highly regarded dentist with a thriving practice. Those who had the privilege of working alongside him spoke highly of his professionalism and calm demeanor. Mary Ellen McManus, who had spent over a decade as Núñez's dental hygienist, attested to his gentle nature, emphasizing that she had never witnessed him lose his temper or succumb to anger. But beneath this serene facade lay a story waiting to be uncovered, a tale that would challenge the perceptions of those who thought they knew him. As the investigation continued, the lines blurred between loyalty, love, and obsession. With the presence of the white SUV in the footage and the drug found in Tom's system, suspicion turned to Dr. Núñez. After Núñez confessed to his affair with Linda, the investigators got a search warrant to search Núñez's office. They found midazolam in Núñez's possession. This was the same drug found in Tom's system during the autopsy. Dr. Núñez was arrested on suspicion of second-degree murder, a little under 3.5 years after Tom Coleman's passing. By May 2016, the stage was set in the courthouse of Kingston as Mary Ellen Albanese, the prosecutor, took center stage. She cautioned the jury that the evidence she presented would be purely circumstantial. No eyewitnesses, no fingerprints, no DNA. But she assured them that she had a wealth of character, motive, and method to lay before them. Albanese's case began to weave a web of evidence, starting with the discovery of the midazolam in Thomas Coleman's system. Yet even this theory had its weakness. The amount of the drug was insufficient for a lethal dose, rarely inducing light sedation. For it to be deadly, it would have required the presence of something else. Thomas Coleman's death further complicated matters. He struggled with various medical issues, including obesity, an enlarged heart, and sleep apnea. Núñez, in a recorded interview, had voluntarily provided information about Coleman's condition, emphasizing its seriousness. Little did he know that this seemingly innocent disclosure would become a pivotal element in the case against him. Albanese argued that Núñez had exploited Coleman's sleep apnea, counting on it to worsen the effects of the midazolam. It was a brilliant solution to address the challenge of the low drug concentration. However, for Núñez to be convicted, the jury would have to believe that he possessed the cunning to devise such a plan, the ruthlessness to execute it, and the recklessness to risk its failure. After all, there was no guarantee that Coleman wouldn't wake up questioning what was in his coffee. Albanese continued to present the bad acts committed by Núñez before the murder, aiming to establish a pattern of behavior. Núñez had sent emails to Linda impersonating his own mother. He did this before Tom's death to convince Linda not to leave him. While undoubtedly strange, the act came across as more peculiar than malicious in the courtroom. And even the failed meeting between the Colemans and the alleged CIA expert arranged by Núñez seemed more inept than sinister. As the trial unfolded, all eyes were on Linda Coleman when she took the stand. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as she began her testimony. The haunting recording of Linda's 911 call resonated through the courtroom, dispelling any lingering doubts about her potential involvement in Thomas's death. The evidence of her affair with Núñez primarily consisted of love notes, posing a challenge for Linda as she assumed her new role. Now testifying against him, undeterred, she plunged into her testimony with gusto. At one point, she said that Núñez's habit of giving gifts was actually a dark character flaw. She revealed that he had showered her with jewelry, clothes, and financial support, even offering financial aid to Thomas for his divorce payments and education. Yet Linda saw these gestures as indications of sinister motives. With startling venom, she proclaimed, "Gil was all about money. He was the one always pushing money on people, always insisted on paying for everything. Every time I saw him, he would give me money." Albanese, the prosecutor, delved into another episode involving Núñez's manipulation. She questioned Linda about the earlier instance in which Núñez had orchestrated a fake CIA scenario. Some texts were sent to Linda insinuating that Thomas was being unfaithful. Disconcerted, Linda saw answers and Nunez offered to investigate. Outside the Holiday Inn, he presented her with a letter allegedly from a CIA agent. Linda dismissed it as sounding like a 2-year-old wrote it, but Albany sought to exploit the incident to illustrate Nunez's manipulative character. Under further questioning, Linda admitted that she eventually came to see the letter as a genuine CIA document. As Linda's testimony continued, some jurors couldn't contain their amusement, with hands covering their face to stifle laughter. The surreal nature of the situation where a poorly crafted letter held weight in a murder case was not lost on them. The proceedings took on an air of absurdity, a dramatic twist in an already complex and captivating trial. Albany seized upon the complexities of the love triangle, recognizing the wealth and material it provided. The incessant communication among the 3 individuals involved created a vast trove of evidence from which selective narratives could be woven. Albany's line of questioning was aimed to portray Linda as a married woman who was initially swept off her feet, but was gradually regaining her senses. This portrayal had some basis in reality. Linda was undeniably torn between her feelings. In an 11-month anniversary card to Nunez, she wrote about the depth of their journey together, their secret heights, yet she also conveyed signals of wanting to end the affair. Nunez responded with both patience and torrents of affectionate declarations. However, there were occasional messages that held a more ominous undertone, hinting at a refusal to let her go. Amidst this emotional turmoil, Linda and Thomas embarked on a weekend trip with their children to the Mohegan Sun Casino in Connecticut. This excursion took place on November 12, 2011, a little more than 2 weeks before Thomas was found dead. It proved to be a turning point as Linda realized she still loved her husband and acknowledged the selfishness of her actions with Nunez. The trip became a pivotal moment in the narrative of marital repair, amplified by a series of tender emails exchanged between the Colemans 2 weeks later, the day before Thomas's death. These messages seemed to support the idea of Linda wanting to break things off with Nunez, but fearing his reaction. The emotional intensity of the situation was palpable as Linda expressed her intentions while Nunez pleaded and begged for her not to leave him. As the trial reached its critical juncture, a startling revelation emerged challenging the prosecution's narrative. Evan Linton, Nunez's defense attorney, skillfully exposed a stark contrast between what Linda conveyed to her husband, Thomas, and what she communicated to Nunez. While the prosecution presented messages implying Nunez's agitation and a sense of impending doom for their affair, Lipton presented a different side of the story. Throughout their trip to Mohegan Sun, Linda was sending Nunez affectionate messages expressing her love and longing. Nunez, however, wasn't encouraging her to leave Thomas. He urged her not to make any decisions until after the holidays, respecting her wishes. This portrayal began to cast doubt on the prosecution's depiction of Nunez as a dangerously obsessed lover, instead painting him in a more level-headed light. The exchange of messages between Nunez and Linda continued as even the Colemans reportedly worked on reconciling their marriage. On one occasion, Nunez texted Linda, expressing the lingering sensation of her kisses. Linda responded playfully, seemingly surprised by her own words as she read them out loud in court. It was a moment of self-reflection, a realization that her version of reality might need to be reassessed. Even in the hours up to Linda's discovery of Thomas's death, she and Nunez were discussing personal matters such as her period, a topic not typically broached after a breakup. The jurors appeared stunned, grappling with the conflicting narratives presented to them. Their gazes often turned to Nunez, a source of bewildering surprises, hoping to uncover the truth behind his somber and enigmatic expression. In a courtroom filled with predominantly white faces, Nunez shared his belief that race played a role in the attempt to pin Thomas's death on him, claiming that he was subjected to racial slurs during his arrest. However, the police vehemently denied these allegations. In the climactic stage of the trial, the prosecution presented a significant piece of evidence. Video footage supposedly proving that Nunez's car, a white Nissan Pathfinder, was indeed outside the gym on the morning of Thomas Coleman's death, a fact that Nunez had vehemently denied. Brand Fredericks, a forensic video analysis specializing in the headlight spread pattern analysis, took the stand to provide his expert insights. The surveillance footage showcased the route from Nunez's apartment to Planet Fitness, capturing a white Nissan Pathfinder with a distinct fog light pattern. The video revealed the vehicle passing various businesses along Albany Avenue, its fog lights unevenly dispersed. One light striking the ground closer than the other, a fault in the mounting. Shortly after, a motion-activated camera at Kohl's next to Planet Fitness recorded an unidentified vehicle entering the gym's parking lot. Although the car's make and model couldn't be determined, one of its lights shared the same defect as Nunez's Pathfinder. Eventually, Thomas Coleman's car parked next to it. The footage, however, did not show any doors opening or closing during the time side by side. When the car with the off-kilter fog lights departed 28 minutes later, it was revealed to be a pale SUV. Soon after, another white Nissan Pathfinder with a defective fog light appeared on Albany Avenue. While the defense challenged the reliability of Frederick's analysis methods, the similarities between the appearance and disappearance of the peculiar vehicle in the parking lot and the timing of the white Pathfinder's movements on Albany Avenue seemed too coincidental to ignore. It was challenging to deny the likelihood that both vehicles were the same and that the car in question belonged to Nunez. The focus of the trial shifted as the prosecution introduced emails found on Coleman's phone from a hookup site called benaughty.com. One email sent a few hours before Coleman arrived at Planet Fitness raised speculation about the circumstances surrounding his death. Initially reluctant to allow the mention of these emails due to concerns about impugning the victim's character, Judge Donald Williams eventually permitted their inclusion as the defense argued that the prosecution's thoroughness should have included investigating this lead. While the presence of a car identical to Nunez's on Albany Avenue remained unexplained, the suggestion of a rendezvous offered a reason to discount it as a mere coincidence. Additionally, a questionable decision by the police further fueled speculation. They had sent Coleman's stained underwear for forensic analysis, but abruptly requested its return before tests for touch DNA or saliva could be conducted. The lack of explanation raised concerns about potential areas the police preferred not to explore. With the introduction of the benaughty.com emails, the prosecution proposed a new theory. Nunez had staged the body to make it appear as though Tom had intercourse in the car. The implication was that Nunez hoped the police, upon discovering a deceased overweight man with his pants unzipped, would assume a fatal arrhythmia resulting from intercourse and refrain from further investigation. As Albanese weaved her intricate web of questions, she proposed a baroquerie. She suggested that Nunez, after giving Coleman a spiked coffee and waiting for him to pass out, meticulously staged the body to mimic a hookup, removed any trace of his own DNA from the vehicle while deliberately leaving DNA of Thomas, Linda, and their son, and waited for Thomas's sleep apnea to render the otherwise harmless dose of midazolam lethal, all within a tight time frame of 28 minutes. The audacious nature of this theory left the courtroom in shock. 2 further charges were produced by the detailed inspection of Nunez's life and were tried. One included an insurance settlement for burning down a building he owned. Less than 5% of the claim, according to the accusations of the prosecution, was fake. No evidence of arson was shown, and the insurance provider did not dispute the broad claim. Falsely completing a gun permit application was the other accusation. Nunez angrily disputed both accusations. The defense on both sides were incredibly complex. On both counts, he was judged to be guilty. The judge revoked his bail and remanded him to the Ulster County Jail to await his sentencing. The day of reckoning arrived in February 2017. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Gilberto Nunez was escorted in, his hands cuffed and his feet shackled. This was the day of his sentencing, the culmination of a tumultuous trial, and had captivated the public's attention. Nunez stood convicted on 12 counts, and Mary Ellen Albanese, the prosecutor, wasted no time in seeking the maximum sentence for each offense. However, Judge Donald Williams appeared skeptical of her intentions. In a rebuke that echoed through the courtroom, he questioned when she had ever pursued consecutive sentences for nonviolent crimes or maximum penalties for minor fraud cases. It seemed as though the judge was not willing to grant her request for a murder sentence through alternative means. After a brief recess, Judge Williams returned to the bench. His demeanor visibly changed. He spoke to Nunez, condemning him as a manipulative liar, devoid of shame, a man beyond redemption. Ultimately, Judge Williams handed down a sentence of 2 1/3 to 7 years in prison. It was not the harshest punishment he could have imposed, suggesting that his earlier moral outrage may have been more for show than anything else. Nevertheless, there was little leniency in his decision. According to Hudson Valley 1, Nunez was released on parole on September 10, 2018 after serving only 19 months in the Altoona Correctional Facility in New York and having no disciplinary issues. Nunez would be required to remain on parole until October 2, 2023. Lipton mentioned that he is still in touch with Nunez, whose ability to practice dentistry was suspended by a New York State review body. Nunez got remarried to Jamili, a property agent in the Kingston region. As we contemplate the bizarre case of Thomas Coleman and the enigmatic figure of Gilberto Nunez, lingering questions remain, challenging our understanding of the truth. What truly transpired on that fateful day in the parking lot of Planet Fitness? Did Nunez orchestrate a sinister plan to end Coleman's life? Or were there hidden factors at play that eluded our grasp? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Daniel Thomas Cotto was born on November 12, 1958, to Carl and Bernice, affectionately known as Bunny Cotto. His parents selected his first and middle names to honor actor Danny Thomas and his well-known lifelong commitment to St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. Danny was the couple's fifth son, and they later had 2 daughters. Carl worked 2, and occasionally 3, jobs to support the family, typically putting in 12-hour days. Bunny cared for the children and the modest family home in the factory town of Springfield, Massachusetts. Danny was an imaginative and mischievous child who reminded his mother of Huckleberry Finn. His strong sense of humor gave him a talent for making his older brothers laugh hysterically. He spared no one from his endless practical jokes, including his younger sisters, but while he would tease them, he also loved them. He would play with them and sometimes made his friends join in for the girls' backyard tea parties. Danny was friendly and outgoing, willing to talk to just about anyone. Danny's antics were not always harmless. He once gave away his father's pocket watch in exchange for some baseball cards, and once, at the age of 11, he drove a car with manual transmission around the neighborhood. While normally such antics would inspire anger at his father when Carl returned home from work and learned about his son's unauthorized afternoon drive, at first, all he could bring himself to say to Danny was, "How the heck did you learn to drive that car?" Like all of his brothers, Danny was an altar server at St. Catherine of Siena Parish. His parents were lifelong Catholics who were very dedicated to their faith. The entire Cotto family had been active members of St. Catherine's since attending its dedication in 1964. Danny was also a member of the Boy Scouts, mainly so he could participate in outdoor activities like camping and his favorite pastime, fishing. He loved sports and played football, street hockey, or kickball almost daily with the other boys from the neighborhood. He took wrestling and boxing lessons with his classmates and excelled at both. Danny would be happy when heavy snow fell in the winter, as it would give him the opportunity to earn some spending money by shoveling sidewalks and driveways in the neighborhood. However, he would not accept money for shoveling snow from one person, the elderly widow who lived across the street from his family. Starting when he was 8 or 9, he would run small errands, rake leaves, and perform other small tasks for her, refusing any sort of payment from her besides milk and cookies. In 1972, at the age of 13, Danny was struggling with the transition from childhood into adolescence, a difficult process which was made even more difficult for Danny due to several circumstances. Danny's wit and intelligence did not reveal themselves in his schoolwork at Our Lady of the Sacred Heart School, and his tendency to talk and to daydream kept him from excelling at academics. He was held back in the 3rd grade, making him a year older than his classmates from then on. Danny had a naturally strong build, and his love of sports and the outdoors helped him grow even stronger. Danny was physically intimidating to even his older brother's friends. Since he was a year older than his classmates, his naturally larger build only increased the gap in size and strength between him and the other students in his grade. According to one of his friends, Danny was as strong as an ox, but he did not seem to understand just how strong he was, and he would often inadvertently mildly hurt his friends while they were playing. The fact that Danny was so physically intimidating made him a target for bullies. He was not one to start fights, but often he had to finish them as other children would start altercations with him in hopes of becoming the person who could finally defeat Danny. He would often be faced with multiple attackers at once, but he still never lost a fight. Danny was generally even-tempered, but when his temper did flare, it was wild and fierce. He would not stand for anyone to insult him or his family. Danny was still an altar server and a Boy Scout, but not all of his activities were as wholesome. Through 3 of his older brothers, he became the youngest member of the Circle, a gang of local troublemakers who took their name from the circular reading area behind the 16 Acres library where they hung out. To get around, Danny mainly rode his bike like a typical kid, but he also liked to hitchhike. He would only accept rides from people he knew, like teachers from his school, but this activity allowed him to regularly stay out late, exploring a wider area than his bike would allow. Danny was thrilled for the end of the school week on Friday, April 14th, 1972. The following day was the first day of fishing season, and Danny could not stop talking about it all week. Heavy rains throughout the week were creating ideal conditions, and Danny could not wait to spend his Saturday fishing. Danny did not take the bus home from school that afternoon, instead walking 1.5 miles before he hitched a ride from a 5th grade teacher from his school. She dropped him off at the end of his street. Danny's father saw him at 3:15 as he was on his way out to go to work. Carl told his son to go back to the house and help his mother with a rug he had found for their sunroom. Danny said, "Sure, Dad," and took off for the house. Danny helped his mother with the rug and then went back outside to play kickball with the other kids from the neighborhood. Bunny called him inside to change out of his school uniform, and he returned outside just after 4 p.m. His mother assumed he would be going to his scout meeting that evening, but Danny said something about going to a party before he went back outside. Danny ran into one of his friends and accompanied him on his paper route. There were sightings of Danny throughout the neighborhood after this, but his exact whereabouts and activities after 4:30 p.m. are not fully known. Carl returned home from work at 8:30 to find his wife worried for Danny, who had not come home from the scout meeting she assumed he was attending that evening. She called around to Danny's friends, but none of them had seen him since the afternoon. None of Danny's fishing gear was missing, but Carl still went out to search local fishing spots in case Danny had decided not to wait for the morning and for fishing season to officially open. Bunny continued making calls. One of those calls was to Danny's scoutmaster, who told her there had not been a scout meeting that evening, and another was to the family's close friend and former priest, Father Richard Levine, who had not seen Danny either. Carl returned home from his fruitless search at 11, and 15 minutes later, Bunny called the Springfield police to report Danny missing. They refused to take the report until Danny had been missing for 12 hours despite Bunny's pleas for help since Danny was just a child. Father Levine called to see if Danny had been found at midnight and suggested that Carl and Bunny try filing a report in Chicopee, the neighboring town where he lived. A police report was finally taken at 2:11 a.m. Carl and Bunny stayed up all night silently praying for their son's safety. Carl went out at 7:30 that morning to search the fishing spots again in case his son had stayed out in hopes of getting an early start. The entire neighborhood soon mobilized to try to find Danny, with the adults calling around and the children searching for him on their bikes. Danny's brother Joseph and several of his friends decided to ride their bikes the 6 miles to one of Danny's favorite fishing spots at the Chicopee River under the Robinson Bridge. However, after making the hour-long bike ride, they found the area flooded with emergency vehicles. The police made them turn back before they could reach the river and check for Danny. The police were at the scene because at 8 o'clock that morning, a local handyman had arrived at the river to fish. When he looked out into the water, he saw a body floating in it. He ran back to his car, noticing a pool of what appeared to be blood on the ground that he had not seen when he arrived. He drove to a nearby junkyard and used their phone to call the police. After police removed the body from the water, they examined the contents of the pockets of its blood-stained clothes. Among the items they found was a piece of yellow exam paper with Daniel Cotto, Grade 7, Our Lady of Sacred Heart School, written neatly at the top of it. Extensive blood evidence was found at the scene, which helped investigators piece together what had happened to Danny. Because of the recent heavy rains, investigators knew that all of the blood had been spilled during Danny's murder. A large 6-inch by 12-inch pool of blood under the bridge was surrounded by markings indicating there had been a struggle. It appeared Danny had been first attacked there and that he at least briefly tried to fight back. Drag marks showed that Danny had been pulled feet first, more than 80 feet to the edge of the river. Another pool of blood was found where the drag marks ended, and a 15-foot arc of blood splatter indicated that Danny, who was most likely completely incapacitated and potentially near death, received a severe beating at this location. Blood was found on the dirt and on nearby vegetation, as well as on several items scattered along the ground, like a piece of rope and a plastic straw. Most of the blood found at the scene was type O, consistent with Danny's blood type. However, type B blood was found on the rope and the straw found at the scene. Given how severely Danny had been beaten, this led investigators to conclude that the killer had cut his own hands in the process of beating Danny, leaving behind his own blood. 2 police officers went to the Cotto family home to notify Danny's parents of his death. Carl was just returning from another search for his son when they arrived. They told Carl that Danny had been in some trouble, which Carl at first took to mean that his son had been taken into custody, and they had to clarify that Danny had been murdered. Bunny knew that something was terribly wrong as soon as her husband and the police came inside and fell, sobbing, into Carl's arms. Carl went with the officers to the Chicopee police station but asked them if they could stop at St. Mary's Parish, less than half a mile from the bridge under which Danny had been found. The family's former priest, Father Richard Levine, was currently assigned there. When Carl told Father Levine that Danny had been found dead, the priest offered to accompany him to the police station. When they arrived, Carl was informed that he would need to identify Danny's body. Father Levine told the police that he would identify the body instead, something Carl took as a kind gesture at the time. Father Levine identified the body at a local funeral home, and the autopsy was performed. The autopsy concluded that Danny came to his death as a result of multiple blunt injuries of the head with fractures of the skull and laceration of the brain. A massive skull fracture, which could have potentially been fatal on its own, was located just behind Danny's right ear, and his jaw was broken. He had been beaten so severely that his various fractures more closely resembled those caused by high-impact events like car and plane crashes. His face was covered in abrasions, with the more severe cuts on the right side and back of his head. Danny had also been strangled. The nature and extent of the injuries would lead investigators to conclude that the killer had been in a blind rage during the murder. Based on the location of the most serious of Danny's injuries, they also concluded that the killer was most likely left-handed. The autopsy also found that Danny's blood alcohol level had been 0.18 at the time of his death. This was almost double the legal limit at the time and more than double under today's laws. Several wads of chewing gum were found in Danny's stomach. Red fibers were found on his underwear and all over his socks, as though he had been walking on red carpet before he died. The exact time of Danny's death could not be determined. Danny's funeral was held on April 18th. His funeral mass and his interment at Hillcrest Park Cemetery were both presided over by Father Levine. He had a closed casket service. Father Levine had told Carl and Bunny on the day that Danny's body was located that they should keep the casket closed because they did not want to see Danny as he was found. Father Levine had not spent much time at Danny's wig the day before the funeral and left it after he instructed Bunny's sister, Betty, who had just flown in from California, to Bunny's sister Betty, who had just flown in from California, to convince Bunny to keep the casket closed because Danny's face was completely disfigured from his injuries. Danny was friendly and talkative, which meant he could make friends with a wide variety of people. This included adult men. Police investigated several men he was known to associate with, as well as a scoutmaster and assistant scoutmaster. However, within a few days of the murder, they learned that there was one man with whom Danny spent an unusual amount of time and that the same man was a strong potential suspect, Father Richard Levine. Father Levine had arrived at St. Catherine of Siena, the Cotto family parish, in 1967. He was a new priest, having been ordained in May of 1966. He had barely lasted a few months at each of his first 2 parish assignments due to his disruptive behavior and poor attitude. At first, he was very popular at St. Catherine's. He was considered to be a dynamic priest who took the time to get to know his parishioners and become involved in their daily lives. He dedicated a lot of attention to the children of the parish, especially the boys, many of whom viewed him as some sort of playboy older brother rather than a member of the clergy. However, Father Levine's reputation soon began to deteriorate. He very much enjoyed rebelling against the more conservative aspects of the church and had very progressive political beliefs, which ultimately created tension between him and his more traditional congregation. Furthermore, Father Levine's extreme temper created problems at the parish. He would scream at parishioners who arrived late to Mass and once threw a book at the parents of a crying baby. Father Levine lasted longer at St. Catherine of Siena than he did at his first two parish assignments, but he was transferred to the larger parish of St. Mary's in June of 1968, a year after he arrived at St. Catherine of Siena. The Cotto family remained close with Father Levine even after he was transferred. While at St. Catherine of Siena, he had taken a great interest in helping the family. He ate dinner regularly with them and showed great interest in the Cotto boys, both of which were considered great honors at the time. If Carl were to be laid off from one of his multiple jobs, Father Levine would bring the family food from the rectory to help make ends meet and offer to help babysit the children. He would take the Cotto boys, along with other boys from the parish, on trips to Vermont or to property owned by his parents where he was building an A-frame house. It was not uncommon for the boys to spend the night with Father Levine even when they were not out of town, sleeping either at the rectory or at the home of Father Levine's parents in Chicopee. By the middle of 1971, however, Danny was the only one of the brothers invited along on trips and for sleepovers. Bunny and Carl appreciated the attention and experiences Father Levine gave their sons, believing the boys would benefit from the priest's influence. Police became concerned over Father Levine and his possible involvement in Danny's murder just a day after Danny's body was found. Chicopee Police Lieutenant Edmund Radvansky was at the crime scene when he came across Father Levine walking along the river. The priest asked two questions, which the lieutenant found suspicious. The first was concerning the tire impressions investigators had made of tire marks found under the bridge the day before. In such a popular hangout with so many cars and footprints, how can the prints you have be of any help? Father Levin asked, according to the lieutenant's report on the interaction. The other, even more concerning question was, if a stone was used and thrown in the river, would the blood still be on it? Father Levine had seen Danny's body when he identified it, but police had not yet discussed the fact that they believed Danny had been beaten with a rock with anyone outside of law enforcement and would not reveal that information to even the Cottos for several weeks. As such, Lieutenant Berdwanski was concerned about the specificity of the question as well as the priest's reasons for asking it. A possible motive for Father Levine to kill Danny was discovered the day after his funeral. State Police Lieutenant James Fitzgibbon, the lead investigator on the case, came to the Cotto family home to speak with the family. He asked Bunny and Carl why they did not have Danny's casket open at the funeral. They told him that Bunny's sister Betty had warned them that they needed to keep it closed because Father Levine had described to her how disfigured Danny's face had been. Lieutenant Fitzgibbon was confused by this and told them that, in fact, the severe injuries Danny had sustained were on the side and back of his head where they could have easily been concealed. Despite the vicious beating Danny had been subjected to, there had been minimal visible damage to his face. Lieutenant Fitzgibbon then spoke to Danny's older brothers one by one and was shocked to learn that several of them had been sexually abused by Levine. When he told Carl and Bunny about this, they were stunned and could not believe that a priest, much less their trusted family friend, could be capable of doing such a thing. As more details about Levine came out in the following weeks, they began to accept the idea that if Levine were capable of abusing their older boys, he was capable of doing the same thing to Danny and perhaps of murder. Someone had called the Cotto house the day before Danny's funeral. Danny's oldest brother, Carl Jr., had answered the phone. The caller would not identify himself and said, "We're very sorry what happened to Danny. He saw something behind the circle he shouldn't have seen. It was an accident." Carl Jr. recognized the voice but could not immediately place it. A few days later, he realized it had been Levine on the phone. Investigators also quickly learned that Levine had lied to them his relationship with Danny. The day Danny's body was found, Levine had told them that he only ever spent time with Danny in group settings when other children or Danny's brothers were present. The very next day, however, a witness came forward disproving that claim. A woman named Mary Boba called police after she saw Danny's picture in the paper along with the article reporting his death. She told them that Danny had knocked on the door of her home in Chicopee on the evening of April 7th, 1 week before he was killed. When she answered, he was shivering as it was very cold and windy that night, and he asked her if he could use her phone to call a Father Levine. She said that he was very polite, and he told her he was lost. This was a strange statement as Danny was in a neighborhood he was familiar with. His grandfather had lived on that street, and he was less than 1 mile away from the home of Levine's parents, where he had been on multiple occasions. Miss Bobuck let him in to use her telephone, which Danny used to call the rectory at St. Mary's, where Levine was assigned at the time, and then Levine's parents' house. She heard him ask to speak to Father Levine, but not the rest of the brief call. Miss Bobuck offered to give Danny a ride as she was on her way out to go to work. He thanked her but declined the ride and said he would wait outside because the priest would be there soon. Just a few minutes later, a Mustang, one of the 2 cars Levine was known to drive, arrived, and Danny got into it before it drove off again. Levine spoke to police again the following day and acknowledged that this incident had occurred. He said that earlier in the day of 7th, Danny had called to ask if they could get together to talk about an upcoming trip to Vermont. Levine said no, so he was surprised when Danny called him from Miss Bobuck's house that evening. Levine said he picked up Danny and then drove to his parents' home where he called Bunny to tell her that Danny would be spending the night. He went to bed while Danny watched television in the basement. He drove Danny home after breakfast the following morning and did not see him again until he identified his body. This account contradicted his own previous claim that he never spent time alone with Danny, as well as Mary Bobuck's statement and statements from Danny's parents, who told police that Danny regularly spent time alone with Levine. Furthermore, Levine claimed he picked up Danny at 7:30, contradicting Ms. Bobuck's statement that he had picked Danny up at 10:30. Ms. Bobuck was positive of the time as when Levine picked up Danny. She was leaving for work, where she arrived by 11 p.m. According to Bunny Cotto, she did not receive the phone call from Levine asking if Danny could spend the night with him until 11:30. When Danny returned home on the morning of April 8th after his overnight stay with Levine, he was not feeling well, and he threw up several times later in the day. There were several failings in the investigation that would eventually lead to speculation that Levine was not investigated thoroughly because of the status the church held at this time in Springfield. A search of the rectory at St. Mary's, where Levine lived, and in Levine's parents' nearby home, where he often stayed and took Danny, could have found important evidence, perhaps a red carpet with fibers that could be compared to the fibers found on Danny's socks and underwear. Investigators did go to the rectory in hopes of examining the clothes Levine had worn over the weekend of Danny's murder. However, the priest who answered the door refused to let them into the building. They never obtained a search warrant for either property. While Levine's strange statements and outright lies to police could potentially be used to successfully petition the court for search warrants today in 1972 with the church held in such high esteem, it would have been much more difficult. Concerns that the church had interfered into the investigation into Levine stem in part from the fact that the district attorney at the time, Matthew J. Ryan Jr., was good friends with Christopher J. Weldon, the Bishop of Springfield. In a 2003 interview, Ryan, who had by then retired, said that while he believed Levine killed Danny, there was not enough evidence to move the case against him forward. What you think and what you can prove in court are 2 different things, he said. Whatever the motivation was, his office did not aggressively pursue search warrants that could have located the physical evidence that could have been used in court to prove Levine's involvement. While the police looked into other potential suspects, they were able to rule them out based on alibis and other evidence. The one person the investigation kept coming back to and the one suspect that could not be eliminated was Richard Levine. While they could not prove his guilt to a legal standard, many of the investigators on the case were convinced that Levine had murdered Danny, an opinion that they shared with Danny's parents. As devout lifelong Catholics who attended church almost every day, Danny's parents struggled with the idea that a priest, much less when they knew and trusted, could be capable of committing any sort of crime, much less crimes as serious as sexual assault and murder. Carl and Bunny did eventually become convinced, based on their conversations with various investigators and their own re-examination of past events without the reverence they had given Levine, that Levine had abused and then killed Danny. They also ultimately came to the conclusion that Levine had gone to so much trouble to make sure that Danny's casket had been closed at his funeral, not for their benefit, but for his own. Once they learned that Danny's serious injuries were in locations where they could have been easily concealed from them by the funeral home, they realized that Levine must have wanted the casket closed so that he would not have to see Danny's body again and be publicly reminded of what he had done to him. The couple struggled with the fact that they never got to see Danny one last time to say goodbye to him. The Diocese of Springfield would later claim to have never received any complaints against Levine until 1986. However, shortly after Danny's murder, Lieutenant Fitzgibbon met with officials from the diocese to go over the sexual abuse allegations against Levine his investigation had uncovered, and diocesan records indicate that the diocese was aware Levine was a suspect in Danny's murder. Lawyers for the diocese arranged for Levine to undergo a polygraph on May 4, 1972. He was asked 5 questions, asking in various ways if he killed Danny, disposed of his body, or had any knowledge of the murder. Levine answered no to each question. In his findings, the examiner reported, due to these erratic and inconsistent responses on this subject's polygraph records, the examiner is unable to render a definite opinion as to the subject's truthfulness. The church then sent Levine to Chicago, where he underwent 2 more polygraph exams 5 days after the first. He was asked the exact same 5 questions and gave the same 5 no's in response to them. This time, he passed. The diocese would use these exams as proof of Levine's innocence in Danny's murder and to justify allowing him to return to active service in the church without restriction. While suspicions about Levine lingered, Danny's case went cold. Levine continued working as a parish priest. 5 years after Danny was killed, he would receive a parish assignment that would ultimately result in the horrifying scope of his crimes against children being made public. Once he was exposed as a predator, more and more of his victims came forward, with many of them revealing not just their own abuse but also information that tied Levine to the murder of Danny Cotto. In 1972, Danny Cotto's family was grappling with his murder and the betrayal of their close friend and former priest, Father Richard Levine. Following the murder, some of Danny's brothers revealed that Levine had sexually abused them, making him the prime suspect in Danny's case. Although Levine had lied to the police about his relationship with Danny and exhibited suspicious behavior after the murder, authorities lacked physical evidence linking him to the crime. Despite this, the church reinstated him to active service at St. Mary's Parish. Levine spent 4 more years at St. Mary's in Springfield before being transferred to a parish in North Adams. In August 1977, the church reassigned Levine to Shelburne Falls, Massachusetts, near the Vermont border, to serve at St. Joseph's Parish, where he would have a significantly longer tenure than at the many other parishes he had been assigned to earlier in his career. However, his time at St. Joseph's would result in the first of a series of events which would ultimately expose an unimaginable amount of abuse and assault committed by Levine throughout his entire adult life and lead to important witness statements regarding Danny Cotto's murder. In October of 1991, Levine was arrested on 2 charges of rape of a child under 16 and 1 charge of indecent assault and battery against a child under 14. The arrest was made after 3 boys from St. Joseph's provided statements about incidents of sexual assault by Levine that occurred between 1988. Levine was surrounded by church officials when he pleaded not guilty to the charges in court. Levine was the first priest, ultimately of many, in Western Massachusetts to be accused of child sexual assault. At the time, many people in the community refused to believe that a priest could be capable of something so terrible. Levine had a large contingent of his congregation from St. Joseph's, who vocally supported him when he was first publicly accused. Those loyal to him described him as a loving and adored priest and believed the accusations were fabricated. At least one member of the congregation suggested that the allegations against Levine were a part of a conspiracy to destroy the beloved priest. Support for Levine continued as the legal proceedings moved forward, and as more accusations of sexual abuse were made against him. On Valentine's Day of 1992, Levine was indicted by a grand jury on a dozen counts for crimes against 5 victims committed between 1982 accused of sexual abuse against children. More and more victims came forward, reporting that they had also been abused by him. By the time Levine went to trial for any of the charges he was indicted on in February of 1992, 19 of victims had come forward, reporting incidents that occurred as recently as 10 months earlier and as early as the late 1950s. Levine was first scheduled to go to trial for 1 count of indecent assault and battery on a person over the age of 14 and 1 count of indecent assault and battery on a child under the age of 14 in late June of 1992. However, on the day the trial was supposed to begin, Levine shocked everyone in the courtroom by changing his plea from not guilty to guilty. This still left Levine's defense team with the task of trying to appeal for leniency in his sentencing, which ultimately was not a difficult task, despite the nature of Levine's crimes. Richard Levine is a good man. There is no evil in this man's heart. What he has done on these 2 occasions does not take away from the good works he has done and from the fundamental goodness and worth of this man, his lawyer told the court. He requested that his client be sentenced to probation and psychiatric treatment. Prosecutors asked for an 18-month sentence with 12 months suspended, meaning Levine would only serve 6 months in jail. Judge Vieri Volterra, prior to sentencing, went on a bizarre rant in defense of the man who had pleaded guilty to molesting 2 children, voicing how upsetting he found it that Levine's excellent career and outstanding ministry had been destroyed by his crimes, which he described as being at the low end of the spectrum. He further criticized the press for covering the mounting allegations against Levine. Judge Volterra sentenced Levine to 2 concurrent probation terms and ordered him to spend 7 to 10 months in the St. Luke's Institute, a church-affiliated treatment center in Silver Spring, Maryland. He did bar Levine from ever serving as a parish priest or living or working with children under the age of 16 as a condition of his probation. He would later say that he did not send Levine to jail because he did not view any of the charges against him as serious. Levine left the St. Luke's Institute on January 27, 1993 and returned to Massachusetts. The diocese did not allow him to return to a parish, but he remained a priest and retained his medical plan in the diocesan pension of more than $1,000 per month. Victims continued to come forward, and he was facing charges in 9 different courts throughout Massachusetts. Ultimately, approximately 50 individuals would come forward reporting that they had been abused, raped, or molested by Levine. Altar servers from every single parish he had been assigned to as a priest were among his accusers. 2 of his cousins also came forward reporting abuse, as did 2 nephews of Matthew Ryan, the district attorney at the time of Danny's murder, whose friendship with the Bishop of Springfield was rumored to be part of the reason why Levine was not aggressively investigated for Danny's murder. Later investigations would estimate that Levine's actual number of victims was around 250. At least one of his victims committed suicide and several others developed substance abuse problems. In 1994, the Diocese of Springfield paid 17 of Levine's victims $1,400,000 as part of a settlement and paid an additional $7,700,000 to 46 victims in 2004. Levine never served any time in prison. Levine was laicized by the Vatican on November 20, 2003. Thomas Deare, then the Bishop of Springfield, did not act on his orders from the Vatican for 2 months. He finally announced that Levine was being defrocked on January 20, 2004. A few months later, the church finally ceased its financial support of Levine, and he received no further payments after May of 2004. In September of 2004, Dupree became the first Catholic bishop to be indicted for sexual abuse. The charges against him could not be pursued further because the statute of limitations had run out. Levine's ongoing legal proceedings brought Danny's murder back into the news nearly 20 years after it occurred. A 1991 article in the Springfield Republican disclosed that Levine had been the only suspect in Danny's case and featured Danny's father, Carl, critiquing DA Ryan for not pursuing Levine for his son's murder. The diocese denied there was any cover-up to the same papers that were reporting on the church's decades-old knowledge of Levine's status as a suspect and the sexual abuse allegations made against him in 1972. Diocesan officials fought against the notion that Bishop Weldon, who had died in 1982, would have ignored the sexual abuse allegations or asked his friend, DA Ryan, to stop pursuing Levine for Danny's murder. Weldon was posthumously accused of raping an altar boy in the 1960s along with 2 other priests. The victim came forward as an adult, and an independent judge would eventually describe his allegation as unequivocally credible. While Carl and Bunny Croto did not publicly discuss Levine's abuse of any of their sons, they did discuss their belief that Levine had murdered Danny with members of the media who covered Levine throughout the years after his court case. This made them the target of harsh criticism and scorn from some of their fellow Catholics. They received angry, hateful phone calls and letters accusing them of being anti-Catholic for daring to accuse a priest of a crime and criticize the church. While Bunny and Carl had struggled with their faith in the years after Danny's murder, they did ultimately remain devout Catholics and active members of St. Catherine of Siena Church. The couple refused to allow the man they believed killed their son or the church officials they believed protected him come between them and God. Give up my faith for Levine, for the good old boy network that protects people like him? No, Carl said in 2002. They can't take God away from us. That's the one thing they can't have, Bunny said 3 years later. While they were confident they knew who killed their son, Bunny and Carl did not ever get to see him brought to justice for the murder. They knew that getting a jury to convict Levine based on circumstantial evidence alone would be a challenge, even after he had faced so many sexual abuse allegations and the deference once afforded to him by his position as a priest was gone. If he was acquitted, we could live with that. But why not take a shot? I think we owe that much to Danny, Carl said in 2003. That same year, Kevin Cullen from the Boston Globe approached Levine while he was outside painting his house. When asked if he had any response to mounting witness statements implicating him in Danny's case, he only provided one. "My silence has been my salvation," he said with a smirk. Carl Croto had a heart attack in November of 2010. The Korean War veteran passed away days later on Veterans Day at Mercy Medical Center, surrounded by family. He was 79. Bunny passed away in 2016, the day before the 6th anniversary of her husband's death at the age of 80. Two of Danny's brothers also passed away while his case was still legally unsolved. Michael Crotto passed away in 2009 at the age of 51 and Gregory Crotto passed away in 2015 at the age of 60. Danny, Carl, Bunny, Michael, and Gregory are all buried at Hillcrest Park Cemetery. As the years went on and the horrifying scale of the clergy abuse crisis started to become publicly apparent, the absolute trust in the priesthood was destroyed in many Catholics, and the church lost the deference it had received from law enforcement in previous decades. In 1991, when Levine was first arrested on sexual abuse charges, the scandal had not yet fully been exposed. While this meant he still had plenty of loyal supporters in his congregation, he was not considered untouchable by law enforcement anymore. Danny's case was reopened in 1991 in response to the renewed interest in it that followed Levine's arrest. By the time Levine was finally defrocked, the clergy abuse crisis, especially in Massachusetts, was public knowledge. The notion that a priest could commit a serious the courts were more willing to rule against the church when it sought to keep its records from the public. Documents relating to Danny's case were unsealed by a judge in 2004, and a further 115 pages of documents were unsealed in 2008 as part of civil legal proceedings between the Diocese of Springfield and its insurance carriers. In 1993, a sample of Levine's blood was collected to be compared to the blood from the crime scene after he was compelled to provide the sample by a search warrant. Levine fought the order in court for 2 years, so the blood was not tested until 1995. Unfortunately, the samples from the crime scene had severely degraded during their decades in storage. The samples were tested in 1996, 2002, 2003, and 2021, but even as technology became more advanced, the samples were too degraded to provide conclusive results. The blood sample from Levine was important in that it revealed that he had type B blood, the same type as the blood found at the crime scene, along with Danny's type O blood. In the United States, type B is one of the less common major blood types, but that still means that approximately 10% of the Caucasian population has blood type B. While Levine's blood type did not prove his guilt, it did not eliminate him as the contributor of the blood at the crime scene either. Levine was also left-handed, as authorities believed Danny's killer was, based on the location of his fatal injuries. In the years following Levine's sexual abuse arrest, several important witnesses with information relating to Danny's case came forward. Some of these witnesses provided information after seeing Levine in the newspapers and only then realizing they had important information about an unsolved murder. And some of them were victims of Levine's, who provided important information when they came forward to report their own abuse. Some of the most important information in the case provided by these witnesses was compiled into a statement of facts written by Detective Michael T. McNally, a trooper with the Massachusetts State Police Unresolved Cases Unit, in 2021. These witnesses are identified in the statement by number rather than by name, and those same numbers will be used here. Witness number 1 was friends with Danny and was also an altar server at St. Catherine's with him. He reported that Levine would regularly give the altar boys wine from the chalice after Mass and then give them gum, which he ordered them to chew afterwards. According to Witness 1, Danny was frequently alone with Levine. On multiple occasions, Levine would drive up in his car while Danny and witness number 1 were outside playing street hockey. When he saw Levine, Danny would begin to cry and then tell his friend that he had to leave before getting into Levine's car. The witness knew that Levine was not taking Danny home as they drove off in the opposite direction of the Cotto family home. Witness number 2 had provided a written statement in 1993 after seeing Levine's picture in the newspaper. The witness had seen a man in his 30s, wearing a priest's collar, drive out from under the Governor Robinson Bridge between 12:30 and 1 a.m., one weekend back in April of 1972. The car the man was driving was consistent with one of the 2 cars Levine was known to drive at the time. The driver looked directly at the witness before speeding away. The witness could not remember the exact day of the sighting, but they did remember hearing about Danny's murder within a week of it. When they saw Levine's picture in the paper, they recognized him as the driver they had seen 21 years earlier. Witnesses 345 had come forward reporting that they had been sexually abused by Levine, with their accounts of the abuse providing important information relevant to Danny's case. Witness 3 had been molested while on an overnight camping trip with Levine, which the Cotto brothers had also attended. Danny had been the youngest boy there and was teased and called names by the older boys. Growing frustrated with the teasing, he repeatedly told Levine, "I'll tell." At that point, Levine's behavior changed dramatically, which the witness believed was a direct result of Danny threatening to tell something. Levine told the older boys to stop teasing Danny and began paying more attention to him. Later on, the witness had knocked Danny over, which resulted in Levine smacking him so hard across the face that he fell to the floor. Witness 4 told authorities that he was regularly given alcohol when he was alone with Levine. He reported once overhearing Levine have a conversation with a parishioner at St. Mary's about him being accused of killing a boy. Levine denied being involved and expressed confusion at why the police were suspicious of him. The witness had not previously heard about the murder and did not know Danny's name. Weeks later, when he was angry with Levine about the ongoing abuse, he asked him why he had to kill the kid, referencing the conversation he had overheard. According to the statement from the witness, that's when Father Levine said it was simply an accident and he told me to leave it alone. That's when he started to say that things could happen to me too. I took that as he could kill me just well. He was very forceful about it. Father Levine had threatened me before one time when I told him I wanted to get out of the situation, meaning the sexual abuse, and I told him I would go to the police. He told me more or less that if I did that, I would live to regret it. I never told anyone about the abuse at the time. I wanted to, but I was afraid. Witness 5 also reported Levine making him drink alcohol. Levine would sometimes trick him into drinking, giving him a glass and telling him it was water, but when the witness drank the liquid, it was a martini. Levine also had a terrible temper and a way of making him feel guilty. They also reported that Levine had driven them past the location where Danny was killed, while police cars were still surrounding the area, and told them that's where Danny Cotto was murdered. The reports from witnesses who were children at the time of the murder all supported the theory that Danny was being abused by Levine and explained some details about his body when it was found, why he was so intoxicated, and the gum found in his stomach. Since Levine used alcohol to gain control over his victims, he may have been the person responsible for Danny being so intoxicated at the time of his death, and he may have given him the gum to cover up the smell of alcohol on his breath. He may also have made Danny drink the weekend before his death, since he returned home feeling sick and throwing up the following day. The evidence of Danny potentially being abused by Levine is relevant to his murder because if Danny were being sexually abused by Levine and threatened to expose the abuse, as Witness 3's account may imply, Levine would have a strong motive for wanting to kill the boy. The other witness report places Levine near the crime scene around the time of the murder, although it is not exact. The statement from witness number 6 did not move the case forward at the time it was given, but it would eventually lead to an important development in the case years later. Witness number 6 had been interviewed by authorities on April 5, 2004. Levine had recently told the witness that he had received a typed and signed letter in the mail. It described the emotions the writer thought Levine was experiencing as a result of killing Danny. Levine told the witness he believed the letter was from Danny's real killer because of the sense of guilt it described. Authorities believed this letter was written by Levine to throw suspicion off of him and on to the anonymous letter writer. Levine and his possible involvement in Danny's death was receiving a lot of attention at the time because of Levine's recent defrocking. A search warrant was issued for Levine's home, and investigators were able to locate the letter and take it into evidence. They also examined Levine's computer to see if they could find evidence of him using it to write the letter, but they found none. While Levine could not be tied to the letter at the time, authorities would use a different methodology to tie Levine to the letter 17 years later. In 2021, Richard Levine's health was failing, and he was hospitalized after injuring his hip and shoulder in a fall. This led investigators to begin one final push to try to ascertain if their only suspect in Danny's murder was in fact the person responsible for his death. While they had plenty of witness testimony and circumstantial evidence, they lacked what their predecessors had been searching for: corroborating physical evidence. They again tried testing the DNA from the crime scene, but it was again inconclusive. They then turned their attention back to the letter seized in 2004. If they could connect Levine to the letter, they could argue in court that his trying to divert blame onto an invented letter writer was a sign of his own guilt. The phone call made to the Cotto house shortly after the murder, blaming Danny's death on something he saw behind the circle, could show the same thing, but there would be potential problems with relying on it exclusively at trial. Danny's brother Carl could testify about the phone call and his belief that Levine was the caller, but there was no way of scientifically proving it was Levine on the phone, and a defense lawyer could call the impartiality of Carl's testimony into question. With the letter, however, there was the potential for more unbiased and scientific analysis that could be more convincing to a jury. In March of 2021, the letter was sent, along with numerous known writing samples from Levine, to an expert in forensic linguistics. The expert would perform an authorship analysis by comparing linguistic patterns in the known and suspected writing samples to determine if Levine could or could not be excluded as the author of the letter. Authorities received the results of the analysis on May 21st. In the opinion of the expert, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, language patterns in the question document are consistent with language patterns in the known Levine documents, to the point that Richard R. Levine cannot be excluded as a possible candidate of authorship. While they were waiting for the results of the forensic linguistic analysis of the letter, investigators also wanted to re-interview Levine. Detective Michael McNally met with Levine 5 times in mid-April, early May, interviewing him for a total of 11 hours at the medical center where Levine was a patient. The interviews were all audio recorded. "I'm awfully glad that my parents will never hear this," Danny's brother, Joseph, said after he heard some of the recordings. During these interviews, Levine did not explicitly confess to killing Danny. However, his story changed dramatically from the accounts he had provided in 1972. Back then, he claimed to have last seen Danny alive a week before his body was found and to have not seen him again until he identified his body at the funeral home. Levine told Detective McNally several different versions of the events of the day Danny died, but 2 important things remain consistent throughout them. He now said he was with Danny near the river under the bridge the day he was killed, and he claimed to have seen Danny's body floating in the water. Levine's overall story was that he had been at the river with Danny, then left him there, then came back a short time later when he saw Danny's body floating face down in the river. His reasons for him being at the spot under the bridge changed throughout the retelling of the events. Levine did eventually acknowledge physically assaulting Danny. Levine claimed to have never hit Danny, but to have just given him a good shove while they were under the bridge. He did not say why he shoved Danny beyond saying he thought he was just trying to get him to stop doing something. However, contradicting that claim, he did detail how he threw a rock into the river after hitting Danny with it. Between the analysis of the letter and Levine's new statements placing himself at the crime scene, Hampton District Attorney Anthony de Galuni believed there was now enough evidence to successfully prosecute Levine and secure his conviction for the murder of Danny Cotto. On May 21, 2021, The day his office received the results of the forensic linguistic analysis of the letter, DA Gallooni authorized investigators to begin the process of obtaining an arrest warrant for Levine. Detective McNally received the phone call from his supervisor authorizing him to prepare to arrest Levine at 5:39 p.m., according to his phone records. However, at 5:40 p.m., less than 2 hours after DA Gallooni's initial authorization was issued, Levine died at Bay State Franklin Medical Center at the age of 80. According to his death certificate, he died of acute hypoxic respiratory failure brought on by COVID-19 related pneumonia he had developed 4 days before his death. At a press conference on May 24, 2021, more than 49 years after Danny was killed, DA Gallooni announced that Danny's case was formally being closed as Richard Levine was finally being identified as Danny's killer. While he would not be able to prosecute Richard Levine, he was confident that his office had finally collected enough evidence to prove Levine's guilt in court. Had Levine's death not prevented a trial, we're disappointed that he is not being brought to justice, but we believe there is a higher power and he will face that higher power now, Danny's brother Joseph said at the press conference. On June 28th, a graveside memorial service was held for Danny, celebrating his life now that there was finally resolution to his case. Approximately 100 people were in attendance. When Danny was first laid to rest, Richard Levine had presided over his interment. In 2021, the service was led by retired priest James Cahill, who has long been a critic of the church's handling of the child sexual abuse crisis in general and of its support of Levine specifically. Danny's brother, Carl, held a portrait of Danny while his brother Joseph played the song Danny Boy for the assembled crowd. While the resolution of Danny's case did not result in Levine paying for his crimes, Joseph Croto told those in attendance at the memorial that it did accomplish something else. This will finally allow Danny, my parents, 2 deceased brothers to finally rest in peace, he said. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.